Beneath the endless hush of desert wind, beneath centuries of sand and silence, there once lay a name, nearly forgotten. A boy king, entombed and untouched. A flicker of gold in the darkness of history. Tutankhamun. He was not a conqueror. He did not redraw the borders of the world or bring empires to their knees. His reign was brief, his deeds few, and yet, long after the great names of Egypt crumbled into myth, his name returned to the world in a blaze of light and gold, not through war, but through wonder. This is not the story of power carved into stone. It is the story of a child in a crown too large, of a throne haunted by gods and shadows, of restoration, ritual, and quiet resistance, and of death, not as an ending, but as a portal. To tell the story of Tutankhamun is to step inside a mystery, into a palace of incense and intrigue, where silence carries the weight of kings, into the heart of a civilization standing at the edge of forgetting. His life is a breath caught between two eras, a whisper between the roar of Akhenaten's revolution and the iron tread of Ramesses' glory. But in that whisper lies something rare, fragility wrapped in splendor, mortality encased in immortality. And if you listen, truly listen, you might just hear the heartbeat of a boy beneath the golden mask. Stay with us. Let us walk together through the veil of sand and time. The halls of Amarna were quiet now. Once they rang with a new creed, a sun-drenched vision of a single god, Aten, the living disk of the sun. But now the paint flaked from the walls. The lotus columns wept with age, and the revolution, once thunderous, had fallen to whispers. It is here, in the soft shadow of a broken utopia, that, as he was first known, opened his eyes to the world. He was born into a court filled with uncertainty. His father, Akhenaten, had shattered the old world. He had cast down the temples of Amun, silenced the gods of generations, and built a city in the desert to house a dream. But dreams, especially royal ones, are fragile things. And so the boy was raised not among certainty, but amidst correction. There is no record of his birth cry, no midwife's scroll, but the echoes tell us enough. He was likely born to one of Akhenaten's secondary wives, possibly the enigmatic Kia, not Nefertiti, though her presence lingered like perfume in every corner of the palace. It was a household of veils, wives, daughters, sons, all bound in ceremony and secrecy. He grew up in corridors gilded by dogma, where even laughter bowed to the sun. Imagine him, small feet pattering across hot alabaster floors, eyes wide beneath shaved scalp and ceremonial sidelock. A prince, but one who did not yet know the weight of it. And outside, the world was crumbling. The empire Akhenaten neglected was fraying at the edges. Provinces whispered rebellion. Priests, once cast aside, waited in the shadows. The old gods, thought banished, returned, not with fury, but with patience. Tutankhamen's earliest lessons were not of conquest, but of silence. His tutors would have been cautious men, Their words chosen carefully, each lesson weighed. The theology of Aten still clung to the walls, but beneath it something older stirred. Perhaps even then they began to whisper the forbidden names: Osiris, Amun, Thoth. The boy watched. He listened, in the way children do when the world is louder than words. When Akhenaten died, and he did, suddenly, perhaps sick, perhaps slain by courtly shadows, the crown passed like a burning brand. For a moment, Smenkhkare appeared, a brother or a puppet or a ghost. Then silence. Then the boy. At 9 years old, Tutankhamun became Pharaoh. The crown was placed upon a child's head. The crook and flail, heavy with tradition, rested in hands still learning to hold a reed. He did not sit on a throne of power. He sat on a throne of broken faith. And around him, the court began to move. I, the grandfatherly vizier, Horemheb, the ambitious general, Meriten, half-sister and political thread, Ankhesenamun, the royal bride, once his half-sister, now his queen. The boy became a figurehead, and the men around him became architects of return. And so began the quiet undoing. The city of Amarna was abandoned. The name of Aten, once carved in every temple, was chipped away. The gods returned, one by one, like exiled elders welcomed back home. And with them, the boy's name changed. Tutankhamun, living image of Aten, became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. A single syllable, yet a signal fire. It wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. A carefully choreographed dance backwards, led by elders who understood the art of memory. And in the center of it all, a child learning how to rule by pretending to rule. What did he feel? That is the eternal mystery. Did he understand the enormity of it, the theological weight of his own renaming? Did he resent the strings, or did he feel pride in being the bridge between the old world and the new? His face, as we would later see in gold, is unreadable. A serene mask, a boy came frozen in perfection. But bones tell different stories. His health was frail. He walked with a cane. His foot deformed, his spine curved. Malaria may have haunted his blood. He was not the warrior king of legend. He was a figure of fragility, and that, perhaps, made him all the more human. He reigned from Memphis, not Amarna. He toured temples being restored, presided over rituals once banned, and issued decrees, likely written by his advisors, that wrapped the old gods once again in silk and incense. And all the while, the sands of time slipped quietly around him. He was a boy trying to live like a god, and perhaps in that struggle lies his truest legacy. Because for all the gold, the splendor, the elaborate death masks and alabaster jars, he remains a boy, not a god, not a conqueror, just a boy, placed on a throne in a world desperate for stability, whose brief reign would be forgotten by history, until history one day unearthed his silence. The boy who had once bowed beneath Aten's radiant disk now walked beneath the watchful eyes of 100 gods. The land was changing, slowly, reverently, as though Egypt itself exhaled for the first time in years. It began with names, always names. Stelae were re-chiseled, temples rededicated. The sacred syllables of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were whispered once more in dark sanctuaries thick with incense and old dust. Where silence had been mandated, now drums and chants returned. The gods were not summoned with a shout, but coaxed, like old friends, back to familiar halls. And Tutankhamun, child of chaos, became their symbol of continuity. He was not a lawgiver, nor a prophet. He was the face of a healing wound. A boy dressed in linen and lapis, lifted high above the crowds, paraded through Thebes as a living bridge between heaven and earth. The crowds may not have known his heart, but they knew what he represented. Return. To restore the gods was to restore Egypt. Every temple stone realigned, every priest returned to their post, every ritual reinstated, was a thread sewn back into the national soul. It was not only theology, it was architecture. In Karnak, craftsmen etched new prayers over old scars. In Luxor, processions marched where weeds had grown. The temples became lungs once more, breathing in the chants of the living and exhaling offerings to the divine. Tutankhamun, in name and image, was everywhere. And yet, everywhere, he was small. The boy had grown taller, but still leaned on a cane. The elegance of his royal imagery belied the truth of fragile bones and a body struggling to keep pace with the ceremonies around him. Each festival demanded hours of stillness. Each speech required composure from lips likely guided by older voices behind the veil. Ai's hand was always near. Horemheb, silent but watchful, recorded names in his ledger like seeds to be planted later. And Ankhesenamun, his queen, once sister, now sovereign companion, stood beside him, not merely in ceremony, but perhaps in quiet understanding. They were young, but not untouched with knowledge. They had seen a revolution fall. They had watched cities empty. They had learned to speak in 2 tongues, one for the gods, one for the living. And together they danced the dance of appearances. In reliefs, Tutankhamun is shown smiting enemies, hunting lions, offering vases to the gods. The poses are perfect, the angles divine. But behind each image is the truth of performance. These were symbols, not records. No arrows were loosed by the boy's hand, no lions slain. The strength was not his, but the kingdom's. And perhaps that was the point. Egypt needed not a strong arm, but a steady image. And so the restoration deepened. Priests were reinstated, not as rebels, but as keepers of balance. The scribes inked their scrolls with renewed purpose. The farmers, long taxed for temples that lay abandoned, now brought offerings again: bread, beer, figs, and silence. The cycle of Mat, order, began to turn once more. And yet, beneath the gold-leafed surface, tensions simmered. Old allies of Aten still lingered in corners of the court. The bureaucracy remembered Akhenaten's chaos. The military remembered its neglect. And as temples rose, so too did questions. Who truly held power? Not the boy with the crooked foot. I smiled too often. Horemheb lingered too long near the throne. Even the high priests, once cowed, began to weigh the value of influence. The court was a tapestry of careful looks and measured silences. And Tutankhamun? He watched. Perhaps he dreamed of real kingship, of decisions made without whispers behind a curtain, of decrees that carried his own voice. Perhaps he felt frustration or resignation, or perhaps he understood that sometimes the truest strength is in allowing a country to heal around you, not because of you, but through you. Still, there were moments when the boy tried to leave his own mark. He commissioned the rebuilding of temples not in his father's name, but his own. He issued edicts calling for the worship of the full pantheon, not just Amun. He reached for harmony, not vengeance. There is even evidence, faint, fragmented, that he sought to be a mediator between worlds, one foot in tradition, one in reform. But the world was impatient. His body, too, betrayed him. Letters from foreign courts, preserved in brittle clay, speak of delayed responses, of a king too ill to travel. He missed festivals. He sent emissaries instead. There were signs of strain, physical, perhaps emotional. And yet, he continued. Because to pause was to unravel all that had been restored. In year 9 of his reign, his face appeared more frequently in inscriptions, his titles more grand, his jewelry more intricate. It is tempting to believe he was stepping into his own, no longer the puppet, but the presence. Then silence. No dramatic fall from a chariot, no heroic death on the battlefield, just stillness. A life brief, burdened, and beautiful, ended before it could fully claim its own weight. The restoration did not end with him. Others would carry it forward. I, briefly, Horemheb, with iron hands. But the boy king had been the pivot, the moment the pendulum turned. In death, he returned to the gods he had once abandoned and then embraced again, wrapped in linen, nested in gold, encased in ritual and myth. His tomb was modest by royal standards, hastily prepared. Yet, even in its rush, it whispered of a life enshrined in reverence. The world would forget him for 3,000 years. But for a moment, just one golden moment, Tutankhamun was the pulse of Egypt, the mirror of its past and the promise of its healing. Not through power, but through presence. In the Valley of Kings, where stone cliffs hold their breath and shadows spill like ink across the sand, a tomb was sealed. It was not the grandest of resting places, not carved with sweeping passages or lined with colossal statues. No rivers of stone, no miles of painted prophecy. It was small, modest, almost rushed. And yet, within that silence, eternity waited. Tutankhamun's death was sudden, Perhaps an infection, perhaps a fall, perhaps simply the cruel indifference of fragile blood and broken bones. There was no royal procession through the length of Egypt, no gilded river voyage down the Nile with thousands in mourning. There was urgency, whispers, arrangements hastily made, a burial fit for a pharaoh, squeezed into the confines of what was likely never meant to be his. The tomb we now know as KV-62. They placed him in the western cliffs of Thebes, in the sacred necropolis where kings had long since traded breath for stone. His passage to the afterlife was prepared not with time, but with reverence. Carpenters worked through the night. Embalmers traced prayers over limbs still soft with youth. Goldsmiths fashioned amulets, hurried but precise. Eyes of Horus, scarabs, falcons, ankhs. Time did not allow for majesty, so instead they gave him magic. 4 nested coffins embraced his form like an eternal chrysalis. The innermost, pure gold, sculpted to his likeness, bore the serene expression of divine peace. But beneath the mask, his body told another story. A fractured leg, a damaged sternum, a heart missing, never recovered. A mystery wrapped in ceremony. Was it ritual or fear, accident or intention? The embalmers had made strange choices. Resin poured too thick, wrappings too hastily. Something was not quite right. But the tomb closed anyway. Sealed. Painted with hurried scenes, Tutankhamun embraced by Osiris. Tutankhamun crossing into the fields of reeds. Tutankhamun watched by Anubis, god of the dead. Yellow walls, cracked by time and heat, but pulsing with ancient hope. Outside, the valley returned to silence. No obelisks marked his place. No colossal statues guarded his name. The sands crept up the slopes, settled into cracks, buried memory beneath wind and rock. Tutankhamun vanished. And Egypt moved on. I took the throne, briefly. Horemheb furloughed, erasing names, smoothing histories, reasserting order. The memory of the boy king faded from stone and scroll. His name omitted from king lists, his likeness absent from monuments. Even in death, he was overshadowed, a footnote lost between titans. But within the tomb, everything remained. The glint of alabaster, the smell of cedar, the rustle of linen. Time passed like dust, slow, quiet, absolute, and yet it preserved. Over 3,000 years, the world above changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Rome conquered and collapsed. Faiths came and went. And beneath it all, a boy slept in gold. Until one day, a stranger knocked on the door of eternity. Howard Carter. An Englishman, tireless, methodical, stubborn. He had searched the valley for years, each season another step into futility. Patronage dwindled, hopes dimmed. Many had come before, convinced that the valley had no more secrets. But Carter believed. On a quiet November morning in 1922, one of his workers stumbled upon a step, a single cut in the bedrock. Dust was cleared, another step, then another, and then the door, a seal intact. The jackal of Anubis, the cartouche of Tutankhamun. The name spoken aloud once more after 30 centuries of silence. Carter wrote of trembling hands, of breath caught in the throat. When the door was finally opened and a candle thrust through the gap, he did not see death. He saw gold. Everywhere, gold. Beds shaped like lions and cows, chariots stacked in corners, thrones of ivory and lapis, chests brimming with linen, oils, papyri, jewels. The burial chamber itself, layered in shrines like giant nesting dolls, wood and gold and spells upon spells, all folded in upon the boy like a lullaby. No tomb had ever been found so intact, so untouched. It was as though time had bowed its head and waited. And there, in the center of it all, the mask, Tutankhamun's face, serene, eternal, framed in blue and gold. Not a mere likeness, but a declaration. This boy, however young, however brief his reign, had earned a god's eternity. The world reacted with wonder and greed. Journalists flooded Cairo. Headlines screamed of the boy Pharaoh. Myths sprang up, the curse of the tomb, whispered to explain the deaths of some who entered. But behind the spectacle, something deeper stirred. For the first time, the modern world met ancient Egypt not through ruin, but through intimacy. Through sandals still laced, through letters still folded, through wine jars half full, through locks of hair wrapped for love. Tutankhamun became more than a mummy. He became a mirror of mortality, of lost youth, of empire and decay, of beauty preserved in the face of oblivion. And though his body was removed, examined, photographed, debated, displayed, the tomb itself remained a testament to love, to faith, to the human need to remember, even when history forgets. Today, when visitors descend into KV62, the air is cool and still. The walls glow faintly with old gods and golden rites, and on a plinth, behind glass, rests what is left of the boy. No longer erased, no longer alone. In that small chamber, barely large enough to turn around, eternity was given shape, not in the form of empire, but in the fragile legacy of a single human life. Tutankhamun, the boy who died too soon, and yet somehow lives forever. In the hush of the palace, amid the scent of lotus and warm cedarwood, there moved two children dressed as gods. He, the boy king, bent slightly with age too heavy for his bones. She, the royal daughter of a broken dynasty, wise beyond her years. Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. Their names are carved together in gold and limestone, painted side by side in sacred tombs, wrapped in the formal embrace of royal iconography. But beyond the symbols, beyond the stylized hands offering incense and the stiff ceremonial poses, there is a question that lingers. What truly lived between them? They were bound by blood, half-siblings, both children of Akhenaten. But they were also bound by circumstance. Two young figures thrust into the heart of a political storm, handed crowns and titles, and told to carry the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. He, crowned at 9, She married by 13. What choice did either of them have? But perhaps there was something more, something quieter. In the worn edges of a letter, in the fragile remains of shared offerings, in the tender way he appears beside her in the murals, not above, not below, but beside. She stands with him in scenes of daily life, not just ceremony. She offers him flowers. He leans gently toward her. These are not the frozen gestures of statecraft. They suggest familiarity, intimacy, perhaps even trust. In a world ruled by priests and generals, where every moment of royal life was weighed for political value, their bond may have been the only space that was truly their own. And yet, it was no ordinary love story. Their union was a symbol, a reconciliation of lines fractured by heretical rule. Ankhesenanum, daughter of Nefertiti, heir to the revolution's bloodline. Tutankhamun, son of the heretic, but now restorer of the gods. Together, they embodied Egypt's healing. But symbols are rarely free. The court watched him. Horemheb calculated. I smiled too easily. The restoration of the old gods was a careful dance, and they were at its center. Every gesture, every proclamation, every procession choreographed. Yet within that performance, they carved out a fragile space of their own. Perhaps on quiet evenings, they shared the weight of it, sitting in a moonlit garden, away from the chants and the statues, speaking not as Pharaoh and Queen, but as two young people who had seen too much too soon. He resting on his cane, she brushing sand from her hem, and the silence between them not empty, but full of all that could not be said aloud. The palace at Memphis, where they lived for much of their reign, overlooked the Nile like a sentinel. Inside its limestone walls, life unfolded in ritual and routine. Meals served in gold dishes, tutors reciting hymns, courters whispering behind veils. But somewhere within that labyrinth of marble and shadow, there may have been laughter, small, fleeting, real. And then, absence. Death came too early for Tutankhamun. Before the years could deepen their bond, before lineage could be secured, the royal couple had no surviving heirs. Two stillborn daughters were placed gently in small coffins, buried with their father in the tomb. The end of a line. Ankhesenamun was left behind, alone, in a world that did not forgive women power without protection. She was queen, but queen to no one. Young, vulnerable, surrounded by ambitious men. And she was terrified. What followed is one of the strangest footnotes in Egypt's long history. A letter, written in haste, sent not to an Egyptian general or a courtier, but to a foreign king, the Hittite ruler, Supilulumama. In the letter she pleads, "My husband died, I have no son. They say you have many sons. Send me one, I will make him king. I will never take a servant as my husband." Desperation laced in ink. She refused to marry I. She refused to let herself be claimed like a prize. Instead, she reached beyond Egypt's borders, an unprecedented act for a queen of the two lands. The request was shocking. A Hittite prince in Egypt? A foreigner on the throne? But the king agreed. He sent his son, Zenanza. He never arrived. Somewhere along the journey, the young prince was murdered, ambushed, silenced before he could ever set foot in Thebes. By whose hand? No one knows. But the message was clear. The game was over. Tutankhamun disappears from the record shortly after. Perhaps she was forced to marry Ai. Perhaps she was removed. Perhaps she died alone, her name lost to time. Her tomb has never been found. And yet her voice remains. In that letter, in the trembling plea of a woman caught between dynasties, trying to shape her own fate in a world that offered her none. In many ways, she is Tutankhamun's true legacy. Not the gold, not the treasure, but the human thread, fragile, defiant, enduring. Together, they were a flicker in a long night. Two young figures standing at the crossroads of faith and empire, trying, in their brief moment, to bring light back to Egypt. And though history tried to bury them, time, patient and strange, unearthed their story in fragments. A ring with both their names. Two tiny coffins. A painted wall where a queen touches her king's arm, not as subject, but as equal. In a civilization that carved its history in stone, these quiet gestures may be the most enduring monuments of all. It is perhaps the most recognizable face in the world. Blue and gold, eyes outlined in kohl, lips closed, yet speaking across time. A face not aged by centuries, but preserved in eternal stillness. The death mask of Tutankhamun. It is not just a relic, it is a mirror, reflecting not only the boy within the sarcophagus, but something far larger, the dreams and illusions of an empire, the aspirations of the divine, the quiet tragedy of a human child wrapped in the myth of a god. We look at it and see perfection, symmetry in every curve, lapis lazuli in the brow, inlaid obsidian in the eyes. The cobra and vulture rise from his forehead in delicate balance, symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, of dominion and unity. It is both crown and veil, armor and halo. But whose face is it? Was it truly his, sculpted from a royal sitting? Or was it an ideal, a sculptor's invocation of divinity, unblemished by the frailties of bone and skin? The boy who wore orthopedic sandals, who leaned on a cane, who limped through ritual halls, he does not live in that mask. And yet, somehow, he does. Because the mask does not show a conqueror. It does not bear the ferocity of Ramesses or the severe gaze of Thutmose. It shows something softer, gentler, a boy holding the burden of godhood with a kind of quiet dignity, not commanding, enduring. The mask was meant to transform him, to make him Osiris, reborn king of the dead, to guide his spirit through the underworld, past gates and demons and the weighing of the heart. Every line of its design is a prayer, every material a spell. Gold, the flesh of the gods; lapis, the night sky, the divine infinite; carnelian, blood and vitality; turquoise, joy and protection. It was not just beauty, it was magic, layered thick over mortality. And yet, for all its magnificence, the mask was never meant to be seen. It was buried in darkness, concealed in nested shrines, locked behind doors that were never meant to open again. It was not created to dazzle museum lights. It was created to be seen only by the gods, to be seen by eternity. But eternity, as always, had other plans. When Howard Carter raised it from the tomb in 1925, he understood at once what he was holding. The silence in the chamber deepened. The glint of the mask in the lamplight seemed unreal. It was not just the craftsmanship. It was the uncanny feeling that a presence was staring back. The world, weary from war and grasping for wonder, gazed into those golden eyes and saw magic again. The mask toured the globe. In each country it visited, crowds stood in hushed lines, staring through glass. In New York, in Paris, in Tokyo, in London. They came not just to see gold, but to meet a ghost, to stand before the quietest of pharaohs and feel something. Wonder, awe, sorrow, recognition. Because what they saw beneath the gold was the echo of a life caught between worlds. The mask became an ambassador, not of empire, but of fragility. It spoke for a forgotten reign, for a buried name. It reminded us that history is not only made by the strong and the long-lived, but also by the brief, the flickering lives that burn quietly, then glow brighter in memory. And yet, the mask is also a puzzle. Modern research has raised questions. Was it originally meant for Tutankhamun? Some scholars suggest the proportions are slightly off, the ears pierced, perhaps repurposed from another burial, perhaps even from a queen. Is it possible the most famous face in ancient history once belonged to someone else? If true, it would be fitting, for Tutankhamun's entire legacy is a palimpsest, written over, revised, reframed. In life, he was overshadowed by fathers and viziers. In death, by tomb robbers and kings who followed. And in rediscovery, by those who sought glory from his silence. And yet, his gaze endures. The mask sits now in the Grand Egyptian Museum, alone in a darkened chamber, spotlit, revered. It draws pilgrims of a different kind, not worshippers, but seekers, those who crave a glimpse of the eternal. And each visitor finds in its gaze something different. For the scholar, a mystery. For the artist, a marvel. For the wanderer, a window. But for all, it is something deeply human. Because beneath the craftsmanship and the divine symbolism, the mask reminds us of the one truth Egypt could never fully escape: that kings are mortal, that gold cannot stop decay, that thrones crumble, that names fade, and yet something remains. A face, a boy, a question. Who was Tutankhamun? The mask does not answer. It only watches, calm, unchanging, waiting, perhaps, for us to look past the glitter and into the eyes of a child born into myth, who wore the crown of eternity and paid for it with a life too short to hold it. In the end, it is not the gold that matters. It is the silence behind it, and the way it makes us listen. In Egypt, gods did not merely reign above. They breathed through every reed, shimmered across the Nile, stirred in the flicker of every flame. They were not distant, they were near, whispers in wind and stone. For Tutankhamun, those whispers began before his birth. He was born into a fracture, a world where gods had been silenced. Akhenaten, his father, had swept away the pantheon in a single radical gesture. He declared Aten, the sun disk, to be the only true deity. The temples were closed, statues defaced, priests cast aside. The gods who had stood for millennia were suddenly absent, and the people silent. In this silence, the boy was raised. The halls of Akhenaten bore no incense, no hymns to Osiris, no rites of passage. Only sunlight and hymns to a single radiant orb. Aten, without face or myth, without mercy or memory. The universe distilled to light. And yet, belief does not die so easily. In homes, in secret, the old prayers were whispered. Mothers still muttered the name of Isis when their children were ill. Farmers left offerings to men before planting. Death still belonged to Anubis. And in the minds of a people shaped by centuries of divine presence, Aten's silence was a hollow note. When Akhenaten died, the vacuum did not last. Tutankhamun, or rather his advisors, moved swiftly. With ink and chisel, they reversed the tides. The gods returned. Their statues were pulled from hiding, washed and restored. Temples reopened. Songs that had not been heard in years were sung again with tears in the voice. The rituals resumed, not merely as performance, but as deep communal exhale. Tutankhamun's restoration was not political theater. It was spiritual repair. To live in Egypt was to live with the gods, not just in myth, but in daily breath. Every act was wrapped in divine attention. Baking bread, sailing upriver, naming a child. Even death was not an end, but a trial, a passage, judged by scales and scripture. The boy Pharaoh's new name, Tutankhamun, was more than a title. It was a signal flare, living image of Amun. Amun, once dethroned, now restored to his full majesty. Hidden but ever present. The king of gods, formless, unknowable, cloaked in wind and silence. It was not Aten's harsh light, but Amun's mystery that now shaped the throne. Priests returned in procession, offerings multiplied, cities renewed their loyalties. And behind it all, the child watched, wrapped in linen and lapis, bearing the crown of reconciliation. But there was complexity. The gods had not simply been returned. They had changed. They were more guarded now, more layered in symbolism and contradiction. The old clarity of divine order had been shaken. The trauma of Aten's singular gaze left shadows. In some temples, the figure of Aten remained, smaller, repurposed, blended into the great hierarchy. In others, his presence was scraped from the stone with deliberate fury. The memory of monotheism was not easily dismissed. It lingered like a half-buried shard in the skin of tradition. And within the palace, the question loomed: what did Tutankhamun believe? Was he a child of Aten, still secretly loyal to the distant sun? Or had he embraced the old gods, not merely as duty, but as faith? We will never know. The records are too thin, the inscriptions too filtered by politics. But there are clues. In his tomb, symbols of the traditional gods are everywhere. Osiris receives him, Anubis guards him, Hathor cradles him. Amulets speak spells that only the priests of the ancient ways could compose. These are not the tokens of a reluctant convert. They suggest devotion, or at the very least, acceptance. More than that, they suggest a longing, not just to belong to a system, but to be guided, to find peace. Perhaps in the end, Tutankhamun did not seek to define the gods. Perhaps he simply sought to walk among them, to restore balance, to be the still center in a spinning wheel of incense and chaos. He was not a priest-king, not a prophet like his father. He was something older, simpler, a servant of the divine. One image in his burial chamber stands out. Tutankhamun, hand in hand with Osiris, the green-faced lord of the afterlife. Behind him stands Anubis, black jackal-headed, quiet and watchful. Above them, stars. Not a sun, but stars. The night sky, the infinite, the hidden. This was the theology that had ruled Egypt for thousands of years, and that Tutankhamun helped to restore. The idea that life is preparation, that the body is not just flesh, but vessel, that death is not a door, but a river crossed with careful spells and offerings. The gods were not always kind, but they were present, and presence was enough. In restoring them, the boy did more than perform tradition. He invited meaning back into the world. He gave the people back their stories, and through those stories, their hope. Today, we may not chant the same hymns or leave figs at the feet of falcon-headed statues, but the longing remains, the need to believe in something larger, something watching, something whispering. In that sense, the gods never left. They simply changed names, changed forms, became quieter. And yet, when we look at Tutankhamun, his tomb, his treasures, his gaze of still gold, we feel the old breath on the back of the neck, the hush that comes not from fear, but from reverence, the whisper that says, "You are not alone." That is the legacy he helped restore. Not empire, not glory, but the invisible threads between the living and the unseen, the whispering gods and the boy who brought them home.
It began with dust, just dust.
a worker's sandal scraping against the edge of a step no one had seen before, a breath caught in the dry morning air, then a shout, then silence. Howard Carter bent low, his fingers brushing against stone carved with the signs of a forgotten name. Tutankhamun. It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. For years, Carter had combed the Valley of the Kings, guided more by faith than evidence. Many believed the valley had given up its secrets long ago. Most tombs had been plundered, their treasures stripped, their stories stolen. Others had collapsed. Time was not merciful. But Carter believed in the improbable. And so, when the steps were cleared and the plastered doorway revealed, sealed and untouched, it felt as though time had paused, just long enough to allow one final whisper from the past. On November 26, 1922, Carter made a small breach in the doorway. Lord Carnarvon, his benefactor, stood at his side. "Can you see anything?" he asked. And Carter, breathless, held up his candle to the dark and murmured, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was cramped, not grand, not lined with colonnades or carved galleries like the tombs of great pharaohs. It was tight, cluttered, filled to the brim with mystery. But it was untouched. That changed everything. Chariots stacked like kindling, thrones pressed against footstools, gilded beds shaped like divine beasts, linen-wrapped food offerings, walking sticks, dozens of them, jars of perfume, ceremonial fans with ostrich feathers still intact. It was not just treasure. It was a life interrupted mid-step. Carter and his team proceeded slowly, carefully. The tomb had to be recorded before it could be removed. Every object catalogued, every fragment drawn, photographs taken with long exposures and breath held. The air was still, the dust thick. Each item disturbed carried not just the weight of gold, but of time. And then the burial chamber. 4 great gilded shrines nested one inside the other, a Russian doll of death and devotion. And at the center, the sarcophagus. Within it, 3 coffins, the innermost solid gold. And inside that, the boy, Tutankhamun. Not myth, not echo, but form, fragile and real. Carter would later write that unwrapping the mummy felt like an intrusion, like eavesdropping on a sacred conversation. But the scientific demands of the time allowed little space for reverence. The body was stuck fast in resin, dark, hardened, and clinging. To separate it, the team had to cut. The boy was dismembered by curiosity. His arms removed, his torso divided, his skull pried from the golden mask. And yet, even in this brutal unveiling, the tomb continued to speak. Tutankhamun was not what legend had expected. He was small, his bones delicate, his foot misshapen. A hole in his skull sparked rumors of murder, though later analysis would suggest embalmers, not assassins. There was no heart, no sternum, some organs missing entirely. Even in death, he remained an enigma. But around him, the artifacts sang. One by one, they told their stories. A dagger made of meteoric iron, a board game with ivory playing pieces, letters, amulets, tiny coffins for his unborn daughters, a lock of hair from his grandmother. Each object was a sentence in a language no longer spoken, but Carter, in his meticulous devotion, translated. The world watched as he did. Newspapers ran headlines of ancient curses. The sudden death of Lord Carnarvon added fuel. Whispers of vengeance from beyond the grave circled the dig site. But Carter remained unmoved. For him, the real power of the tomb was not in fear. It was in memory. Tutankhamun's burial had frozen a moment, a brief reign, a fragile life, a world caught between collapse and restoration. And now all of it was visible, tangible, lit by electric bulbs and flash cameras. Egypt's government watched closely. The world watched eagerly. Politics and prestige circled the tomb like vultures. But inside, the silence endured. For years, Carter and his team worked to clear the chambers. Object by object, soul by soul, the tomb emptied. Each item taken to Cairo, placed behind glass, protected but removed. And with every artifact lifted, the tomb seemed to sigh. It had kept its secret for over 3,000 years. Now, its story was no longer buried. Tutankhamun, the erased, the forgotten, had returned to history, not through conquest or lineage, but through presence. A still face in a sealed room. A name carved once, then buried, then spoken again with wonder. The tomb did not give us answers. It gave us questions. Who was this boy, really? What dreams had he held? What fears had stirred behind his gold-painted eyelids? What did it mean to be a god in the body of a child? The tomb offered no voice, only echoes. But sometimes echoes are enough. Sometimes a still room can speak louder than 1,000 monuments. Today, the chambers are quiet once more. The treasures gone, the walls faded. Tourists pass through with reverent hushes. Flashlights beam into corners once lit by oil and incense. And there, in the burial chamber, on its painted yellow wall, Tutankhamun still stands, welcomed by Osiris, guarded by Anubis, encircled by stars. The tomb no longer hides him. It reveals him, not as a legend, not as a god, but as a boy who died too soon, buried too modestly, and remembered too brilliantly. Because in the end, the tomb was never meant to remain closed. It was meant to wait until we were ready to listen. Immortality. It sounds like a gift, a blessing from the gods, a reward for greatness. But in the world of pharaohs, immortality came not through the soul alone, but through stone, through legacy, through name. To be remembered was to live again. To be forgotten was the second death, the one no magic could reverse. Tutankhamun, in life, came dangerously close to that second death. His name was struck from king lists, his image erased from monuments. The reign of the boy king, so brief and overshadowed, was soon folded into silence. Horemheb, the general who became Pharaoh after Ai, completed the purge. In his drive to restore order, he buried the memory of the Amarna period and everyone attached to it. Akhenaten, Smenkhare, even Tutankhamun. It wasn't personal, it was political. Egypt needed stability. The gods had returned, but so had unrest. Priests wanted clarity, generals wanted hierarchy, and history wanted clean lines. So the past was revised, names deleted, dynasties redrawn. Tutankhamun became a ghost without a story. His tomb, small and hastily finished, was likely overlooked because it was hidden, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. Rubble from another burial lay above the entrance. Time drifted over the stone like a burial shroud. For over 3,000 years, no one spoke his name. No pilgrim offered prayers at his memory. No priest lit incense in his honor. No child learned of his deeds in temple schools. But the gods, if they watched, were patient. When Carter broke the seal, the silence was undone. And in that moment, Tutankhamun became immortal, not as the Egyptians had imagined, but in a way no one could have foreseen. He became famous. Suddenly, the boy king was everywhere. Newspapers, books, exhibitions, films, fashion. Gold flashed in department stores. Designers mimicked his mask. Tourists crowded Cairo. Children knew his name. The ancient pharaoh, once nearly erased, became a global icon. But what is the cost of such resurrection? Because the immortality he received was not the kind the ancient texts had promised. Not the quiet, dignified journey through the field of reeds. Not the sacred rituals performed eternally by priests in his honor. Not the resting of bones beneath prayers and stars. Instead, his body was disturbed again and again. He was X-rayed, CT scanned, dissected by cameras and scholars. His DNA sampled, his lineage debated, his death speculated on headlines and documentaries. Malaria? A chariot accident? A broken leg? Incest? Curse? Every new theory pulled him further from peace. Tutankhamun became not a person, but a puzzle. Not a soul, but a specimen. And perhaps that is the true irony. The boy whose body was wrapped with care, whose tomb was filled with spells and amulets to guide and protect him, now lies in a climate-controlled glass case, not to preserve his spirit, but to preserve his fame. We stare through the glass, we photograph his face, we whisper about his bones, but we do not know him. We cannot, because somewhere along the line, his immortality stopped being about memory and became about spectacle. Still, there is something beneath the surface, something deeper than the gold and the gossip, something human. Tutankhamun reminds us of the fragility of power, of how history forgets, and how it sometimes, accidentally, remembers. He reminds us that greatness is not always loud, and legacy not always planned. He did not build pyramids. He did not command legions. He did not conquer kingdoms. And yet, he endured. Long after the mighty fell, long after stone temples crumbled and scrolls turned to dust, it was the boy in the modest tomb who returned to light. Perhaps there is a lesson in that. Perhaps immortality isn't about glory. Perhaps it's about resonance, about the face that draws us in, the life that stirs our empathy, the silence that makes us wonder. Because in Tutankhamun's story, in its gaps, its enigmas, its unanswered questions, we see our own longing to be seen, to be known, to matter, even for a moment. And so his immortality lingers, not in the way he lived, not in the way he died, but in the way we remember him, not as a god, not as a king, but as a boy buried in haste, discovered by accident, and immortalized by wonder.
He wore the crown, yes, but the hand that placed it on his head was not his own. From the moment Tutankhamun became pharaoh at just 9 years old, the throne did not rest solely beneath his feet. It rested in shadows, in the spaces between elders' glances, behind the drapery of ritual, in the whispers that moved faster than decrees. He was king, but others ruled. At the center of this hidden architecture of power stood 2 men, I and Horemheb. I was old when Tutankhamun was born, a seasoned courtier, advisor to Akhenaten, perhaps even connected by blood or marriage. He knew the palace corridors better than most knew the gods. He had survived one reign, adapted to the next, and positioned himself as the boy's guardian and guide. To the world, he was vizier, but in truth, he was the architect of restoration. He helped steer Egypt away from heresy, not with fire, but with gentle chisels. One relief at a time, one hymn rewritten, one god returned to a sanctified altar. I smiled behind the throne, but his hands held the reins. And then there was Horemheb, younger, sharper, quieter. A general with the eyes of a strategist. He commanded armies, yes, but also attention. Where I governed with legacy, Horemheb watched with ambition. He had no royal blood, but he carried the bearing of a king. Tall, disciplined, calculating. A soldier who understood that nations are not built on prayers alone. Together, they surrounded the boy. I, the soft voice. Horemheb, the silent threat. What did Tutankhamun think of them? Did he see I as a grandfatherly figure, a source of counsel and comfort? Or as a gatekeeper, the man who shaped his words before they left his lips? Did he trust Horemheb, admire his strength, or fear his growing shadow? The records do not tell us, but the arrangement was clear. The boy king was both center and pawn. Officially, he issued decrees. He ordered temples built. He led rituals. But these acts were crafted, prepared, orchestrated. The voice was his, the intent was theirs. And yet, he was not entirely without agency. There are signs, subtle, scattered like breadcrumbs. A letter sealed with his own mark. An edict issued in his name with corrections in his handwriting. Artistic depictions showing him engaged in ceremonial smiting, bow drawn. Whether symbolic or aspirational, they suggest a self-image beginning to take shape. Perhaps, as he grew into his role, he tested the boundaries. Perhaps, as his legs carried him more confidently through the courtyards of Memphis and Thebes, he began to ask, "What is mine to decide?"
But power, like incense, is elusive, hard to hold, and often those who reach for it too soon find it turns to ash. There is little evidence that Tutankhamun ever fully stepped into independent rule. He died before he could challenge before he could replace Horemheb, before he could father an heir strong enough to anchor his line. And when he died, the shadows closed in quickly. Wasted no time. He officiated the boy's burial rites, a role typically reserved for the successor, a sacred act, a symbolic transfer of power. And then he took the throne. Pharaoh Briefly, his reign was short and carefully crafted. He finished many of Tutankhamun's projects, possibly to legitimize himself. He built a tomb, larger, richer than the boy's. And in his own mortuary temple, he carved images of himself wearing the crown. But time was not on his side. He died within 4 years. And then the silence broke. Horemheb returned. The general claimed power not through birth, but decree. He declared, had failed. The gods had chosen another. And so Horemheb, the soldier, the reformer, became Pharaoh. His rule would be long, determined, and merciless in its revisions. He scrubbed the names of Akhenaten, Smenkhare, and Tutankhamun from the records. He erased completely. In their place, he positioned himself as the true restorer, the hand of divine justice. In the king lists that would be passed down through dynasties, Horemheb appeared as the final ruler of the 18th dynasty, as if the boy king had never existed. Power does not always destroy with violence. Sometimes it simply forgets. And yet, it didn't work. Tutankhamun's name was removed, but not erased. His tomb was small, but sealed. His body fragile, but preserved. His soul passed into the silence of history, but not into oblivion. Because history, like the gods, watches. It waits. And 3,000 years later, it whispered his name again, this time louder than ever. Today, and Horemheb are footnotes. Important, yes, strategists and restorers. But their faces do not adorn gift shop mugs. Their names are not spoken by schoolchildren across the world. Their stories are studied, not felt. But Tutankhamun, the boy, the enigma, the buried king, lives on. Perhaps the price of their power was his silence, but the price of his silence was immortality.
A name. 3 syllables, once nearly swallowed by sand. Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. Once it was spoken in hushed reverence across Egypt, proclaimed at sunrise rituals, etched in stone beside offerings of bread and beer. And then, almost as quickly, it faded. For centuries, it lingered beneath rubble, buried beneath politics and neglect, beneath newer kings, greater temples, rewritten chronicles, until the dust was cleared and the name rose again, gleaming in gold. Today, it shimmers across museum placards, echoes through documentaries and coffee table books. It sits atop banners, merchandise, travel posters, perfume bottles. His name, once erased, is now everywhere. But what does it mean to wear a name like that? What does it mean to have your identity carried not by memory, but by myth? Because the Tutankhamun we know is not just the boy who ruled and died. He is a mosaic, pieced together from fragments, guesses, photographs, legends. He is the gold mask, the glittering throne, the lotus-shaped chariot wheel, the ceremonial fan with ostrich feathers still intact. He is the echo of footsteps in the Valley of the Kings, the hush of visitors standing before his sarcophagus, the eyes of a child staring back through time, carved in lapis and outlined in ancient black. But beneath all of it, the treasures, the reverence, the spectacle, there remains a human. A young boy, a son, a brother, a husband. A king who reigned between giants, not through might, but through presence. Who died before his story could take shape, yet left behind enough to haunt generations. Tutankhamun reminds us that history does not always belong to the strongest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who endures, the one whose life, though brief and quiet, touches something in us we can't quite name. There is an intimacy to his legacy. Unlike the colossal figures of Egypt's past, Ramesses the Great, who carved his face into mountains, or Thutmose III, whose armies thundered across borders, Tutankhamun left us not with power, but with proximity. He left us objects worn by human hands, garments faded by use, a board game half played, a lock of hair, the tiny bodies of his stillborn daughters. He left us a story not of conquest, but of fragility. And perhaps that's why we return to him. Because in his tomb, we don't see a god. We see ourselves, yearning for meaning, cradling rituals, facing death with as much grace as we can muster. Tutankhamun's legacy is not what he built, but what he preserved. A glimpse, a breath, a flicker of the ancient world as it truly was, not stylized or monumentalized, but lived. When Carter and his team opened the tomb, they expected treasure. What they found was something far rarer: continuity, a thread across time. The realization that the people of the past were not so different, that they too feared and hoped, loved and lost, that they too placed meaning in small objects, in sacred names, in gold shaped by trembling fingers. The name Tutankhamun now glows with recognition, but it also carries burden. It reminds us that immortality often comes not from intent, but from accident. that the path to being remembered is rarely straightforward, that behind every myth is a person, breathing, aching, unsure. And perhaps in that understanding lies the truest form of reverence, not in spectacle, but in stillness. To look into the eyes of his golden mask and see not a deity, but a child. To hear his name and think not only of kingship, but of time, soft, relentless, and tender. To speak his name not to glorify, but to remember. Tutankhamun, a name once lost, a name now etched in gold, a name that reminds us that even the smallest stories, if preserved, can shape the world.
And so the boy sleeps, not in silence, but in song, carried on winds that whisper through the valley of the kings, across stone cliffs and golden dunes. His tomb no longer sealed, his name no longer hidden, but his story still unfolding, still elusive, still echoing. Tutankhamun did not live long. He did not conquer. He did not reshape his world with sword or decree. And yet he endured, not because he sought immortality, but because perhaps he became its quietest shape. In a world that often celebrates only the grand, the towering, the loud, it is his stillness that speaks, his gentleness that lingers. A cane resting by a gilded bed, a broken foot beside a lion-headed throne, a mask radiant and serene, sheltering the tender truths of a fragile life. He was the last breath of a vanished dynasty, a child of contradiction, born in upheaval, crowned in restoration, buried in haste, and yet remembered in wonder. His legacy is not in what he ruled, it's in what he left behind. Not just objects, but questions. Not just gold, but presence. Tutankhamun reminds us that history is not always forged by the mighty. Sometimes it is shaped by the forgotten. And in that, we find something eternal. A name in gold, a tomb in shadow, a boy still watching, still waiting, like a breath in the sand.